Diane, we should talk later if you want some other co-hosts for any other.
Okay, yeah, I think we have a couple of them, but okay.
Because I'm in another women's organization too, so.
Okay. So somebody from Friends of the Library is going to do opening remarks with names of partners. Is that what I understood, Lisette?
That's me, right? Is that me, Lisette, or is that another piece?
Yes, that is you, and we are live.
Okay.
So just a couple of minutes before we get started. But everyone can see and hear now.
And I'll be admitting everybody at 7 o'clock. Okay, I am now turning on recording.
I think we're ready. Diane, are you ready? All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Contemporary Conversations, sponsored by the Friends of the Library, Montgomery County and Montgomery County Public Libraries. I'm Frances Frost. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Friends of the Library, Montgomery County. Thank you for joining us to discuss the centennial of the 19th Amendment in the United States. Tonight, we'll hear about the origins of the suffrage movement, its evolution, and its implications for today's social justice movements. FOLMC is honored to be a co-sponsor tonight and a sponsor and a supporter of Montgomery County Public Libraries. If you'd like to learn more about us, these speakers, or to purchase their books, please visit our website, folmc.org, and a link will be dropped in the chat. So now, without further delay, let me introduce Diane Habino, co-president of the League of Women's Voters here in Montgomery County, who will moderate the discussion tonight.
Good evening. Thank you very much. And thank you to Friends of the Library, Montgomery County, for sponsoring this suffrage event. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. It says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." Those were pretty powerful words, and it not only took an act of Congress, but it also took ratification by at least 36 states of the United States at that time. And it took until August 26, 1920, which is next week, to actually certify the ratification. And that's why we're celebrating today and this month for the passage of the 19th Amendment. But you know, what does it really mean? Which citizens were actually affected by this amendment and which were not? Those who still could not vote. So I'll give you just a little bit of history that back in the 1880s, many Western states allowed women to vote. They maybe owned land, maybe men needed their vote, and besides, they were very strong women. But it took decades for everyone in the United States to have that right. It started in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott met to organize others in this effort. And as I said, it was 70 years later when this was finally passed. Although voting, for example, was allowed in the South, there was voter suppression in terms of intimidation, violence, and poll taxes that kept many other African-American women and men from voting. But we are pleased tonight to have two women speakers who are authors of books on this movement and also on leaders who spearheaded efforts to gain civil rights for their people. We have Rebecca Roberts, who is the daughter of Cokie and Steve Roberts, well-known journalists, and she earned her degree in political science, worked for a political media firm in Philadelphia. She was a technology reporter for The World by BBC and hosted a news talk show on WETA. Besides authoring the book, Suffragists in Washington, D.C., she's the curator for programming for a new museum called Planet Word. More to come later on this. Ida Jones, our second speaker, is an archivist at Morgan State University and the author of many biographical books on civil rights leaders among the American community. Names like Kelly Miller, Mary McLeod Bethune, William Jernigan, and Victorine Adams of Baltimore. She curated an online exhibit for the National Women's History Museum called Claiming Their Citizenship, African American Women from 1624 to 2009. She's a historian, as noted in her many positions and publications. Welcome to Montgomery County Friends of the Library suffrage event. So let's start with you, Rebecca. Tell us a little bit about your book, Suffragists in Washington, D.C., and how maybe it gives you some insight of the women's movement for them to gain the right to vote, and perhaps also some of the individuals who dedicated their lives to it.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you everyone for being here and adapting to this format and celebrating the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment this week, 100 years ago. I actually got interested in the 1913 March because I'm on a lot of boards, but I'm on the board of Historic Congressional Cemetery on the east side of Capitol Hill. And on the 90th anniversary of suffrage in 2010, I wanted to see if there were enough people who had been involved in the movement, either pro or con, buried there, that I could write a special walking tour. And there absolutely were. But what was so amazing to me was that when you do research in a cemetery, what you're mainly reading is obituaries. And all of these women, woman after woman, mentioned this 1913 March. And a lot of these were elite white women who, you know, nice girls didn't show up in the paper. They didn't want to make news. So, you know, their obituaries would list like their debut and their marriage and maybe what sorority they'd been in if they had gone to college, and marching in this 1913 parade. And I had never heard of the 1913 suffrage march. I thought civil rights marches were invented 50 years later. And it got me on this track of realizing how many tactics of contemporary activism, you know, things activists do today, this week, that were actually invented by the suffragists. And they did it so well. And they affected the single largest change to American democracy without, you know, resorting to armed rebellion. And it's extraordinary. Now, they weren't perfect. I'm not here to put halos on them. I admire what they did. In individual instances, there are times when you really wish they did better. They made decisions that were wrong, that were racist, that were short-sighted. They competed with each other in ways that sort of hurts my heart. But you can learn from their counterexample too. You know, you can see what they did and do it better. You can see what they didn't do and do it better, and really learn how to be a fantastic activist from the example these women set for us.
Thank you. Okay, let's ask Ida Jones a question, and then we'll get back to you. Dr. Jones, you're an archivist, an author, and historian. So can you explain your position as archivist so that all of us have a good role, idea of your role at Morgan State University as an archivist?
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me, friends of the Montgomery County Library, and Ari Brooks and her team. I greatly appreciate the invitation. What an archivist is very interesting because most people are unfamiliar with our profession. So I always equate it to the restaurant and the farm. The librarians are the restaurateurs. So they're the ones you see who seat you in the lovely spaces. And the archivists are the farmers, which mean we engage the raw material and the raw data that make the books that go on the shelves in the library. The archival profession or archival profession is a longstanding profession of over 100 plus years, but has always been kind of rather cloistered like nuns and not very open to people who are not cerebral or extremely academic. It is as of the last 40 to 50 years, we've become more open in regards to letting people know about our craft and what we do. And the materials that we deal with, we kind of anthropomorphize them, making them human-like because they're irreplaceable. The documents, the photographs, the items we curate literally cannot be replaced, and they're one of a kind. So it's very important that we maintain very strict orders, police-like tactics, and lawyer-like admissions to our collection. So that's what I do at Morgan State University. They just turned 150 in 2017, and I'm the first formal archivist they've had. So it had devolved to the responsibility of librarians who are sister profession, understand the idea of responsibility and curating. So it's nice to work in concert with our sister profession.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to continue with you, Ida. We would like also to have to hear a little bit more about Mary McLeod Bethune, but not only her story, but the lessons that you learned in doing the research for today's world.
Yes, Mary McLeod Bethune is to the 20th century what Frederick Douglass was to the 19th century. And she's literally the prism through which we see refracted the light of civil rights, social justice, activism, kindness, mentoring, education, and almost any other adjectival phrase that is uplifting that you could begin to think of. What I had come to learn about her, I thought I had known who she was until a colleague challenged me to kind of do another book. The Kelly Miller book was my first book, and as every firstborn intellectual baby, it was my heart. So I really kind of loved Kelly Miller, and he was very much involved at Howard University, another second love of mine. But when I was challenged to look at something else outside of that, and I said, well, Mary McLeod Bethune lived in Washington. There's a house in Washington. She's done some things. Let me look at the archival material, because Mrs. Bethune started the National Negro Women's Archives in 1946. So she was very clear in understanding the value of archives and incorporated Dorothy Porter Wesley and Dr. Carter G. Woodson into her vision. So there were archival materials that had been existing in the council house home that's run by the National Park Service. And those materials are a wealth of information that really chronicle in real time and in their voice the activity of Negro women and children through the National Council of Negro Women. So I thought I knew who she was, and the tip of the iceberg was looking at that house, and it's a far larger life that she lives outside of that house and through that house, because she was living in two states, here in Washington, D.C., and then also in Florida, where she opened her school that is now known as Bethune-Cookman University. So looking at her life and understanding her activity as the first African-American appointed to a federal government position with what they call the Black Cabinet, is a very amazing thing, because towards the end of her life in Washington, D.C., and she was asked, what would you do? She said, I'd run for Congress. If I had to live my life over again, I'd go to New York and I'd run for Congress. And she said, Adam Clayton Powell wouldn't have to worry. There's enough votes for all of us and enough space for all of us. So she understood the power of the ballot. Although she wasn't an activist in terms of suffrage sign carrying and sign wearing, she was very much strategic in what Audrey McCulsey calls politically ambidextrous, because she lived in the Deep South and understood that there was some physical threat that could have encountered her life and her school. So she understood very clearly how to engage politics in an ambidextrous fashion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That brings me to, and Rebecca, we will go later on maybe about your Planet Word Museum, but let's stick to this subject and talk maybe a little bit about how you mentioned right now, Ida, the success that Mary McLeod Bethune had. How did the women in the movement succeed? What were some of the strategies they used to promote their message and promote the need for voting rights? And what types of messages and what types of means are needed today to promote similar messages? You know, back in the day, Rebecca, they didn't have Facebook or Instagram. How did they do it?
Well, I mean, I can only imagine what they would have done with social media tools. It is extraordinary how they were able to make messages go the 1917 equivalent of viral with the tools they had. I think they would absolutely exploit whatever tools we have. But, you know, when you ask what tactics they used, there were a lot. It was a 72-year movement. And so with a lot of different leaders and a lot of different branches, in the early days, they made great use of the petition, right? This is a movement where the women started by definition with no power whatsoever, right? They couldn't introduce legislation. They couldn't hold office. They couldn't make this happen without appealing to the people who had that power. And so they were big on petition drives because that felt to the members that they were appealing to, that there was a groundswell of public support around this. But you know, no matter how many names are on a petition, if none of them vote, then how much does the member actually care, right? So then you started to get into more sort of lobbying, state by state lobbying. And there was a big split in the movement. A lot of, I'm gonna rip through like 80 years of history here. So if I'm going too fast, please ask questions in the chat. But a lot of the early suffragists were abolitionists. They got involved in the movement because what they really wanted was abolition, thought they couldn't have it without the vote. So the vote was a means to an end. So then after the Civil War, when the 15th Amendment enfranchised Black men and no women, there was an enormous split. So people like Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass and Julia Ward Howe said, we'll take the 15th Amendment, we'll enfranchise Black men, we're abolitionists, this is important, we'll work for women next. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony said, we can't support the 15th Amendment as written if it enfranchises Black men and no women. So not only did they split with each other, they split on tactics. So the Stanton-Anthony branch continued to push for a federal amendment, and the Stone-Blackwell branch went state by state. And some of that was that they were worried that the Southern states were still sort of smarting from the Reconstruction Amendments, that had been federal overreach, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and that they would have more luck going bit by bit. But it wasn't working very well by the 20th century. You mentioned those big empty states out west, which enfranchised everybody because there were like 11 people living in them and they were trying to maximize their political power. But by the turn of the century, there was not much to show for the suffrage movement. So all those years of petition drives, all of those local lobbying at legislatures, including overtly racist lobbying. The suffragists would go into Southern states and say, if you enfranchise women, it will ensure white supremacy because the white women's vote will overrun the Black vote. It never worked anywhere they used that argument. And so by the beginning of the 20th century, the movement was desperate for new tactics. That's one of the reasons the 1913 March mattered so much. And that the image behind me is the pageant that coincided with the march on the Treasury steps. And talk about imagery, right? So it's not just an Instagram age that cares about a viral image. This pageant, this woman, it was this kind of tortured allegory, the pageant of Columbia summoning the virtues, and the virtues were like hope and peace and prosperity. But that's her, Columbia, standing there in her armor on the Treasury steps. It had nothing to do with suffrage, that pageant. It just looked really great in pictures. And she's still the cover of my book 100 years later. So they were incredibly conscious about that. And then they started to invent tactics that really pushed the envelope a little bit. A lot were borrowed from the much more militant British movement led by Emmeline Pankhurst. But for instance, picketing the White House, right? Which the National Women's Party started to do in 1917. I promise you, if you go to Lafayette Square right this second, there will be people picketing there. No one had ever done it before. It was 100% invented by the suffragists. Even the mayor of DC authorizing the Black Lives Matter mural on 16th Street, she could have picked another street, right? That's not just a statement. It's a statement that's meant to be in the face of the president that disagrees with it. And that there's so many echoes of the suffrage movement in contemporary activism that I could really bore you with a really long list. But this idea of gaining attention, grabbing whatever focus they could, even during World War I, when focus was really elsewhere. Viral messaging by holding up banners in front of the White House that were really easy to read and take pictures of, so they'd be reproduced in newspapers everywhere. That might not be Twitter, but it's the functional equivalent 100 years earlier.
Yes, I have seen some of the cartoons and some of the other articles in newspapers that the women used to spread their message. It was, yes, not only these great kind of photo ops, but it was also the use of media that was used at the time.
No question. And cartoons, I think, actually are a really important part of that because like any movement, you need to know your opponent in order to figure out which, which argument might sway them. And the anti-suffrage political cartoons were such a window into what those arguments were. So there was the, garden variety sexism, women are too stupid and fragile to handle the vote part. And those people's minds were probably never going to be changed. But there were so many other more subtle arguments within that, industries that employed child labor were anti-suffrage. There were a lot of women who were anti-suffrage because they feared this transgression into the public sphere and that would undermine the importance of the private sphere. A lot of men were just really nervous that suddenly there'd be, there are all these political cartoons of men like covered in a baby in one hand and dirty dishes in the other and diapers hanging everywhere while his wife goes off to vote. And, as if voting takes that much time, but it's a window into what people's fears were. And if you understand them, then you can counteract them.
And we still use cartoons today. So Ida, Rebecca mentions Frederick Douglass, and I know reading somewhat about Mary McLeod Bethune, there was a difference of opinion. Do you work alone, only with your own kind, like maybe African-American women working together? Or do you reach out in a more biracial effort to enlist more support? I think she tried to do that. And I'm also wondering what your opinion is. How do you reach success? Do you work within your own community? Is that in very effective ways, or do you try to broaden the ways of trying to make success? Rebecca mentions a split with some of the women wanting to go one way and some another. Do you feel that is also true in some of your research, that there were differences of opinion of which way and how to go forward?
That's a very good question, and it's one that is rather contentious in a contemporary sense because we want to sanitize our ancestors and see them as rather revolutionary and so fully actualized. They are only as actualized as well as the society was formulated during the times in which they lived. So the polarizing language that does birth itself out of the abolitionist movement, which grows into the women's movement, started with the fracture even with the abolitionist movement, because there were those abolitionists who believed in abolishing the system and instituting African people as full citizens, those who believed in just simply repatriating those, quote, formerly enslaved somewhere far west or back to Africa. So there was already fracture in terms of what does that mean with, quote, the ugly institution of enslavement. So when it now births the women's rights movement, as you say, in Seneca Falls, although there were several meetings prior to Seneca Falls, where there had been interracial conversation about rights. And so the idea of women or other persons of otherness or others to be able to get rights as citizens. The women's rights movement asserts its greatest voice in Seneca Falls, where there were no African-American women welcomed and or invited. The only person of color was Frederick Douglass. And he was a feminist, and he was very much an advocate for women's rights, as well as that of African-American rights, because the whole idea of intersectionality, the term we now coin, that there is no freedom unless all are free. So any kind of oppression would then lead to some degree of oppression because we have to, quote, hold those persons down to maintain ourselves a kind of superiority. But it does become very polarizing by the 1860s after the Civil War, and with the discussion of this 15th Amendment and the franchise being extended to either one group of others or another group of others. And so it's politically expedient to give it to men, because they say it's African-American men, but it's not just African-American men, it's all men who were propertyless, who were basically voiceless prior to 1870 when that amendment was passed. So it didn't just usher in Black men, every other kind of manhood came with it. And there actually is a challenge by Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who is one of the feminists who were very much involved from the 1840s forward, saying that she tried to register to vote in the 1870s in Washington, D.C., because she said there's nowhere stipulating that gender is a reason to not vote. So she's arguing the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, and the 15th Amendment in terms of the franchise, and she registers to vote. And of course, it is not received very well, but she argues, she was a law school graduate of Howard, and is very clear on her perspective. But I just need to read some of the language that Frederick Douglass speaks about in 1869 at the American Equal Rights Association Convention, where he's very clear saying, I must say that I do not see how anyone can pretend that there is the same urgency in giving the ballot to women as to the Negro. With us, the matter is a question of life and death. When women, because they are women, are hunted down throughout the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their homes and hung on lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then will they have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. So the urgency of the Negro was much more crucial in terms of finding a vote and a voice in the body politic. And another Maryland native, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was very much involved with the movement, sides with African-American men. She said, I will lay down the lesser issue of sex to pick up that of race. So it becomes an issue for women of color, and particularly African-American women, as my vantage point, having to kind of deal with that duality. So when you get to a Mary McLeod Bethune, as well as a Mary Church Terrell and others in the 20th century, trying to walk that contentious point of otherness, dual otherness, really becomes a problem, because the urgency of white women suffragists were so desperate for them that they did want to kind of close ranks with Southern women who were basically infected by racism, to say, okay, we as white women, educated women, women of middle class and upper means want the vote. So we have to kind of negate or lessen the voice of African-American people. So I don't think it was a matter of choice, it was a matter of being relevant. So people do go to their silos and they function in their silos. And there's times where Bethune and others did reach across, quote, the aisle, if you would, to white women's organizations, and Lucy Stone and others did kind of help facilitate that conversation. But it's a very contentious one, and one that we're still dealing with in terms of our national conversation.
Right. I mean, I think you can't assume all choices are open to everybody, right? Mary Church Terrell is one of those people, because she was so enormously well educated and beautifully dressed, she sort of passed the status symbols of white judgment. And so she was often the only Black woman at white women's suffrage meetings. And because she, passed some sort of a standard that they cared about, but that's one person, right? That's not a movement. That's not integrating the movement. And so it wasn't a choice. When Ida B. Wells formed the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, that wasn't, making a statement that African-American suffragists needed to be a separate group. It was, we have power and you aren't letting us in, and we're going to exercise our power with each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is so true. Thank you. So I'm wondering if we can look at some of these, not differences today, but how, based on some of these women and men who worked in the past, because after all, you have to remember that when the amendment was first passed in Congress, there were no women there. Excuse me, I think there was one woman there. So
Annette Rankin.
You did need the support of men in order to move forward. So we did need that. But today, I'm wondering if we can look at how political, economic, social leadership can be attained by women. What is it that women, it seems, for example, in academia, Ida, that women are presidents of colleges and universities. They seem to have reached that leadership role. But I'm wondering how women today can move forward in the same way. Does it take a new movement? Does it take a continuation? We haven't really mentioned in the 70s, there was a feminist movement where women of all colors stepped out and tried to move forward. But where are we today? We still, compared to many other countries of the world, are not doing well in leadership roles, including in the private sector. So do you have, and especially also the political sector. So can you perhaps, Ida, and then Rebecca, give us some of your ideas of how we can build on the past shoulders of others?
That's a very good question. And that is one that's very pertinent in light of our current Democratic slate for presidents with Biden and Harris. So you see there's been some aspiration there. However, there is at the same time a report that just came out that African American women earn less than white men of 62 cents to their full dollar, below the white women who are 70 cents. And I think Latinos maybe somewhere in the 50-cent range. So it's almost nearly $900,000 plus at the end of a 40-year career it would take for her to earn as much as it would a white man. So there is economic injustice, and there's been built into the system, but we are seeing happening both locally or nationally that there is a turning of the tide. Numerically, women are starting to outnumber men. So by numbers alone, there's going to be a shift in the conversation. And then our younger people are not as tolerant or as, let's say, demure as our ancestors or ourselves in, quote, questioning these things or simply just upending them. So I think there's going to be a situation in which it's going to push an urgency to the conversation that we will have to demand representation. You have a lot of young women who are running for Congress or various levels of state leadership and city leadership across the country. They're in their 20s and 30s. And it's very parallel to how their great or third great grandmothers would have been during the turn of the 20th century. So there's always been an urgency to kind of want to share the wealth, so to speak. It's not I'm better than you, I should be in charge, but how do we move forward? And then if you don't define we as being everybody who's living and breathing in a bipedal person, then who is your we? Because then that will be too small of a we to consider. So I think what we're seeing now in this conversation in terms of the language turning into women of color or persons of indigenous or foreign background, our language is shifting. Our arts are also shifting. And our conversation about history is also shifting to really call things out as they were. Not to indict anybody in terms of being wrong, but simply to question how our mindset has been framed over the course of time and how our mindsets need to change. So I think what we're going to see happening with the educational shifting and decolonizing syllabi and decolonizing classrooms and changing the names of buildings. And I don't say tear monuments down. I was in a conversation about that, and it's a non sequitur, but the monuments need to remain. They need to be interpreted and understood in the context of time and when they were created. So we're having more conversation. And this is the information age. And if this could be any silver lining to the ugliness of coronavirus, it has forced us all to look at ourselves individually, ourselves in our nuclear families, our extended families, and ourselves as a nation. And so we now have no distractions. And we're forced to really see who we are and understand how we got here and really see what will the next incarnation of mankind or America be after this is over. So it's going to definitely rewrite the narrative and recast who and what is human and who and what we is. So that's where I think we are.
And I also think that the young people of today are more encouraged by their parents, by the next generation older, to do whatever they want to do and not be so constrained as before. Go ahead, Rebecca.
I was just going to say that I think that the diffuse nature of the contemporary women's movement, which can feel disorganized or disunited, is actually in some ways just an evolution of the fact that we have lots of things we can fight for now. You know, in that 1913 parade, there was this enormous banner that said, "We demand a constitutional amendment enfranchising the women of this country," right? They had this, it was called the Great Demand Banner. Well, we in 2020, we demand a lot of things, right? We demand equal pay for equal work. We might demand abortion be safe and legal if that is your cause. We might demand to be free from sexual aggression, whatever it is. We have lots of demands. It's not one banner. And in some ways, that's something we can now do because our foremothers fought for this very basic right with the vote. But it also does feel like we're not united together with each other. And when I first started talking about the parallels of contemporary activism to the suffrage movement, and especially the 2017 Women's March was so obviously a parallel. It was pre the Me Too movement. And I think that moment did coalesce a lot of feminists together under one cause, one banner. But since then, even that collection has spread out again. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing. You know, I don't think we need to be nostalgic for every woman being shoulder to shoulder fighting for the same thing. I think that it is a privilege of contemporary society that we have many things we're fighting for.
So you're saying that some of it has dispersed, some of that, but also I read how polarized our society appears today, how it's, if you're not with us, you must be against us. and that maybe there are younger people who are trying to push forward, but there must be an almost equal number of unseen but other young people who don't agree or will not stand up and be counted, as it were. So how do we get that dialogue going, Rebecca? What do you think? And then we'll ask Ida.
I don't know. I have to say, I'm really encouraged by young people. I have 3 teenagers. You know, 2 of them are going to college this fall, sort of. And I am impressed with them enormously and their friends. I think that they are very confident that they have a voice and that they can make a difference. And they don't all need to agree with each other either, you know. Disagree, we live in a democracy. We're allowed to disagree. So, but I am not somebody who clutches my pearls over the future of civil discourse. I actually really do believe that the next generation is smart and engaged and principled. And of course they're bad actors, but they're bad actors my age too. So I'm not fearful on that score. And I also think that it takes us, you know, Gen Xers and boomers and whoever we are, to sort of realize that they might not do it the way we did it, and that's okay. You know, that they have language that has evolved and tools that have evolved and ways of expressing their minds that have evolved. And that for us to be nostalgic for them to do it the way we did it is not a productive thing.
And Ida, some comments from you about this?
That's a very good question, a very good point. I do agree with Rebecca on a number of points. I think what we have been clouded with in the past, and this is all of us, is the means. We now need to look at the ends. When there is a water crisis in Flint, when there is ozone layers and there is global warming and, you know, various kinds of, what is it called, derechos and other kinds of meteorological terms we're all learning now, that we're all being affected. So it's no longer about the means. What is the end? We all want to live in a clean, safe, healthy environment. I think we all can agree on that. So if you want to fly, I want to drive, someone wants to walk, someone wants this, let's just agree on where we're trying to go. And the getting there does not make a difference as long as we arrive. And once again, the we is, who is the we? The we, I think, would be all of us in terms of humanity. So because we have been stratified and variously siloed into various groups and all these other kinds of definitions and terms, at the end of the day, we all need clean water, clean air, safe environments, and, you know, limited gun access. So at some point, all of the ends is going to help us look at the means, because we're going to realize some of the fracture we've experienced. We can't forget the fracture. We acknowledge a fracture, we put something there to acknowledge it, but we need to close ranks like a good Star Trek episode and either get off the planet and get back to the home base, or we simply don't exist. So I don't mean to make that trivial, but it's very clear that I think the younger people, because of the debt, because of the environment, I mean, the pollution in the ocean, just the environmental crisis alone will threaten their very lives, because there are diseases and other kinds of maladaptive behaviors that will cause problems. So for them, it's very real. And all of us, it should be very real. And for the Flint water crisis to still be going on X amount of years later, for certain people to have pipes and access and irrigation, it's insane in terms of what's happening. So once again, we're going to have to simply mute the voices of all this dissent and really agree on what is the end. What do we want? And that needs to be a focus.
I think you're both right. I think that finding common ground, but also being able to listen and not step on others' toes in trying to reach that, whether it's a clean environment or good healthcare. We all want ourselves and our elders and even our young ones to be healthy. So finding that common ground and working toward it is very important. But we are also in an age of disinformation, of information and social media. And while we can credit the movement of news to inform our younger upcoming leaders who are on social media all the time, what do we do when there's disinformation or misinformation in the media? I mean, do people still believe everything they see and hear? How does this play into maybe the aspirations and all working toward the common good when there is other kind of stuff out there that may not always be true and might lead a whole group of people a different way? What do you think, Rebecca?
I mean, again, I give people, and particularly young people, a little bit more credit than that. And I don't think there was some magical time when all sources of information were truthful and trustworthy. I mean, you can read the anti-suffrage arguments that voting was going to make women sterile, right? So to draw another parallel, like there has always been disinformation, there has always been propaganda, there has always been information manipulated for political means. I think what we're seeing is a difference now is the speed with which it spreads and the ability to make it look official if you fake it well enough. But I also think that as that grows and changes, you know, maybe it's people my age who are a little bit caught in the middle where we feel like we're not quite sure what a credible source is. But actually people a generation younger are growing up with more of a skepticism of that because it's been such a common thread throughout their lives. But I also think that there is an upside, and I seem to be coming off as super Pollyannish in this conversation, but I do think there is an upside to having the tools of information be more democratic, right? So of course they are misused, but the fact that you can publicize your cause, the fact that you can reach people who might agree with you but aren't in your immediate area, the fact that we are not only reliant on the old white dudes who run newspapers to give us our news, you know, I think let's not overlook the advantages while we're decrying the disadvantages.
That's very true. Ida, what do you think about the speed of information moving, but the speed of also disinformation and misinformation moving? Is that a detriment to, I don't know, progress?
No, I think it's a great thing. And I would say that's also a silver lining of the Trump administration, has been a way to force us into a degree of wakefulness, or wokefulness as the term is now. And in terms of being sponsored by the Friends of the Library of Montgomery County, that's the best place to start. I know as a young person in elementary school and high school, our school librarians, for those that remain, because I know they're trying to update a lot of those positions as well, were places to engage. They would post up things, whether it was particularly Black History Month or Women's History Month or whatever event there was a library that did have information, and whether that was politically slanted, because we as librarians or information service providers have our own biases, but it does start a conversation. And I always tell my students and those other researchers that once you have an idea of what you don't like and you kind of learn what you do like, then you should always know the pro and con of a particular perspective, because that gives you information. And it doesn't have to be that you agree with everything, like the anti-suffragists, for example, and there were women who were anti-suffrage. You can't believe, well, why would a woman be against suffrage? Because they had their agenda as well. So whether we agree with their agenda or not, they still had a right to be able to express themselves and their particular opinion. And that, I think, has been lost in terms of our current discourse, because it's either all or none. And so there's been, of course, so much glut of information. And I did explain to one student, I said, unlike, I'm a Gen Xer too, Rebecca, that in our time, the TV went off. There was actually a time when TV went off. They're like, what? Yes, the TV stations went off. And so they would play the national anthem, they would beat the flag, and then it was like snow. So I said, your generation does not turn off, which is a bittersweet advantage, because it doesn't give you time to marinate and really process thoughts, because you want to be hot, you want to have the quick Instagram, you want to be the first person out there. Well, jumping out first is a microwave version of cooking over a log fire. So they both are cooked, but one has a different level of marination to it. So I explained to them in particular, it's going to take time, and it's going to take the collapse and expansion of your own life and information to be able to arrive. So it's not going to be quick. And I think they want to be quick, and they feel that they're losing time. Maybe that's just youth. I don't know if I was ever that speedy. I've always been quite the tortoise, but nevertheless, I think that's what they need to do, to kind of understand that it takes time to grow into consciousness. And as they change, your perspectives will change. I have one of my friends who's plus 60 who said, yeah, you get more conservative the older you get, because you realize I put my time in, and these people want everything for free. They need to work. So your perspectives change.
Yes.
And what you're comfortable with changes. I mean, you can read the 1930s hand wringing that radio was going to mean that no one ever read a book again, right? You know, everybody wants things to stay the way they were when they came up. And adapt or get frustrated by the fact that you haven't adapted. Those are really your only two choices because change is going to happen.
Exactly.
Exactly. And I think that's something they don't understand because it happens so quickly. So you have the new phone this month, 2 months later, it's another phone, 3 months later. So it's literally constantly changing that nothing ever has any longevity to it, or longevity has a smaller window of time than it would have been in, quote, the 20th century, way back when. So,
But luckily, the newer generations can also think and react faster. So for them, it's just moving along as it should normally. So speaking of information moving, Rebecca, tell us a little bit more about the Planet Word Museum that is it open or soon to be open?
It is soon to be open. And I know this is a little bit of a tangent, so I won't talk too long on it. If people have specific questions about Planet Word, I'm happy to answer them in the chat. So Planet Word is a new museum of words and language. We're opening in the historic Franklin School, which is a DC schoolhouse from 1869 at the corner of 13th and K Northwest. And it is, when you're a word museum, you don't have a collection, right? It's an experiential museum that explores all the fantastic things you can do with words. So there's a songwriting gallery and a speech making gallery and a joke telling gallery and a magical library and a whole gallery about how words enter the English language and etymology. And we were hoping to open in May and we're not, but we got lucky that we can, we're in the position to wait until it's safe. So stay tuned. planetwordmuseum.org is the website, but look for us at least in some kind of a soft opening schedule this fall. The museum will be free. And we, because we are dedicated to a love of words and language, just like libraries are, we absolutely look forward to working with DC Public Library because that's our jurisdiction, but other libraries around the region to work together to advance that mission of literacy. And when we talk about adapt or die, it's kind of the vision of the museum as well, that English is not stuck in amber. There is not some perfect time when everyone used all the same grammar and all the same vocabulary and all the same punctuation. And the fact that people use language differently now than you might have used or learned in school is not some symbol of the, apocalypse. There was not some magical time when everyone spoke a standard English. Standard English does not exist. If you were taught that standard English exists, you were taught that probably by a master's degreed white guy on the East Coast, and you taught that his English was standard English. And so it evolves, it changes. That's what's so cool about English. People use it all the time and innovate with it. And so we are not prescriptivist, we are descriptivist. And language has got to change whether you like it or not, so you might as well like it.
Okay, great. So planetword.org may be soon to be open. So we have about, I think, 10 minutes left. Are there any questions from our participants? I think we have, 36 people participating tonight. If you have any questions, you can certainly write in the chat box, and one of our speakers or both will answer your questions. Was there something that either of you wanted to add that we haven't talked about already that you'd like to make a different point or add to it? Please.
Yes, if possible, might I do my commercial?
Okay, sure.
I wanted to just acknowledge the National Vote for Women's Trails. The National Collaborative Women's History Sites is an organization that has been seeking to document suffrage on a local level, and there are state coordinators throughout the country, all the volunteer army of women. So you can go to National Votes for Women's Trails. There's a virtual exhibit as well as physical markers that are being put up sponsored by the Pomeroy Foundation that will capture the local history of suffrage in a particular locale. So from Alaska to Hawaii to Washington, D.C. to Samoa, all these places where women's votes and women's suffrage mattered. And I'd also like to celebrate the work of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center in Maryland, who's doing great work as well. They have about 4 or 5 markers up. They have been innovating some great activity, and they'll be participating with Beyond the Ballot and Beyond with Maryland Preservation. So you'll be able to hear some oral histories and biographies of women who participated in both the ballot as well as beyond, those who actually held positions. So That's my commercial.
Great, thank you for announcing.
Diane, there's a question in the chat. I think it just went to me that says, I'm an elementary school librarian. What advice do you give to my young female students? And I'll flip this to you after I say something too, because I'd love to hear what you have to say. I actually occasionally teach some girls' schools just as a guest lecturer on suffrage. And I like to make them really mad by reading the anti-suffrage arguments because they get so outraged that people ever said that about women. But it serves to sort of drive home the point that you have power and people fear that power and therefore you should use it. But also I do think that there was a time when you needed to sort of reinforce to young people that they could take on social issues and that they could make their voice heard. I'm not sure we need to convince them anymore. I think between Malala and Greta and the Parkland kids and the Black Lives Matter activists that they see so many examples of young people sharing their voices, but they might wonder how to do it. And I have one of many books coming out on this vein with my co-author Lucinda Robb. It's coming out next month. It's called The Suffragist Playbook, and it's how you can take lessons from the suffragist movement to become an activist yourself as a young reader. But I've had the experience that girls and boys get pretty jazzed about that. If, whether they want to get a stop sign on the end of their block, whether they want to get more funding for their local animal shelter, whether they want a voice in what books are added to their curriculum, what the cause doesn't matter. It's that they feel like their opinion in the cause matters and that they have some tools to affect it.
Great. Okay, thank you. Ida, there's a couple of questions from people. You quickly mentioned the trail and they want you to describe it and give information on how they can find more information about it.
Yes, I've just put the link in the chat box there. And seemingly the Women's National Votes for Women's Trails is leading the effort to document the activity of women in a local fashion. So they have been coordinating with historians, laypersons, and others to create a map, a digital map, where you can upload your actual sites and you can actually see the map that has over 1,600 sites throughout the country. And it talks about who those women were and what those spaces were, because some of those spaces no longer physically exist. They have been reconstituted or reworked. So the intentions are for us to make an interactive conversation about the next 100 years of understanding women's suffrage. Because even though it is a historical event, we simply want to chronicle those spaces and places that might no longer be with us as gentrification and other things happen to physical locations.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think, let's see, there was one other question about where people can go to support Planet Word. And let's see.
Yeah, I'm going to put the website in the chat. It's planetwordmuseum.org, and there is a newsletter. If you sign up for the newsletter, or if you're on social media and follow it on social media, that's where the opening announcements will be. That's where we'll recruit volunteers and docents and all of that. So.
Okay, there's another question probably for both of you. What are the most exciting aspects of the modern feminist movement? We've talked a lot about the younger people and name names of people who are leaders, but talk about maybe others who are in this modern feminist movement. And is it all for the good? Or are there any troubling signs or challenges that you can think of as we move forward? What might be some of the challenges today?
Well, I have to talk about the Me Too movement, and I think that's been a very salient conversation. I have watched a number of, Dateline-like docudramas or what have you on various aspects of the 1980s, and I think people don't understand, at least those of us who are not living, the kinds of pushback women who are aspiring during the 70s and 80s experienced in terms of language or other kinds of behavior that is clearly litigious in this day and age. So we've recently acquired a lot of things in terms of rights, but I think the Me Too movement calling out, bringing lawsuits, and really kind of quote unquote shaming those individuals for their behavior is extremely impressive and mind-blowing. So I think that the Me Too movement, in particular for gender issues, really transcends race because it's simply a matter of the objectification of women's bodies. So when we see what happened to Harvey Weinstein and other individuals that have exploited women and girls, in particular to, I think it's Epstein as well, that we now have this conversation in a public space and really are being able to engage has been huge. Because if you watch TV from the 50s or the 60s, women were treated basically as objects, and that's not that long ago. So when you look at the 1980s in particular and the kinds of things women had to overcome, now 30 years since the 80s, bringing this to the fore, it's basically saying that we cannot roll back the tide. It's going to continue to move forward. So that, I think, and I don't know the number of women that are involved in that. I know Tarana Burke is one of them, but there are other women on various state and local levels who are pushing back on the Me Too. And I really applaud them for that, the athletics as well as those in corporate spaces.
Yes, thank you. How about you, Rebecca? What else do you see as challenges moving forward, or even positives moving forward?
I totally agree with Ida about the Me Too movement. I think that that has been not only had some real visible successes, but it's also been a uniting force for women who might have been getting a little weary or a little dispirited with women's rights in a contemporary setting. I do also draw hope from the number of women who are running for elected office. I think that we have record highs now, but it's set to be even more, that every candidate recruiting school, every training program is absolutely oversubscribed with women who want to run for office. And of course, we won't all agree, but I do think that seat at the table is so vital. It's amazing what gets added into legislation when there's a woman there to say, or on the basis of sex, or on the basis of marital status, or, let's make sure that these research dollars don't only go to studies that only study one gender, right? So I think that every election, we're just going to see more and more women in public office. And the more that that's normalized, and the more that more men vote for women, and that's not just a niche thing to do, we're going to see the effects of that in so many fields.
Okay, thank you. And that's a good segue for my plug for this coming election in November. And the League of Women Voters is putting out its voters guide as usual in print. But because of the virus today, we are mailing 70,000 voters guides to households. And for the first time this year, we also have a voters guide in Spanish. So our voters who speak Spanish can read about the candidates and the positions that are up for election this year, as well as just urging all of you, if you have not, you must register to vote. You have until October 13th. And while you're registering, if you're registering online, please apply and ask for a mail-in or absentee ballot, because that is probably the most safe, lowest risk way of voting this fall. And then you will automatically receive that absentee ballot. And again, if you have any concerns about the US Postal Service, take your ballot when you receive it, fill it out, sign it, and drop it off at a drop box. We're planning to have them, or the Board of Elections is planning to have them at all of its major voting centers, which will be all the high schools in Montgomery County, plus about 10 other large community spaces. So I think it's very important this year that you understand how this election is going to work. Of course, if you want to vote in person, it'll be November 3rd. And if you want to vote early, it'll be open, the polls will be open from October 29th through November 2nd for early voting. So there really is hopefully no excuse for not voting this year. We like to see a high voter turnout, and you can vote for whomever you wish, but just get out there and vote. I think we're almost out of time, so I'm going to thank both of you who spoke with us tonight, Rebecca Roberts and Dr. Ida Jones, and the Friends of the Library, Montgomery County, for putting on this event, as well as all of you in the audience. I hope you learned something and got to understand a little bit more about what has transpired before and maybe hopes for the future as well. Thank you all for your time spent with us.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you too. Get out there and vote.
Okay.